Thank you for taking some time out of your busy schedule to watch this slide presentation about dyslexia. This is going to be a very quick overview of what we know after 40 plus years of research about how kids learn to read and hopefully give you some information about when you should be concerned. So it's a misconception that learning to read is a natural process. While our brains are pre-wired to learn to speak and understand language, it is not pre-wired for reading and writing. We'll take a brief look at the parts of the brain involved in learning to read a little later in the presentation. But for now, it's important to know that children have to be explicitly taught the written code that represents the sounds they speak and hear in words. And while some students' brains will map that code more easily than others, every student will benefit from explicit, systematic, and sequential instruction of the writing code. Now, the great news is that reading is the most studied cognitive process in humans, and we know that 95% of students can successfully learn to read if we use evidence-based methods of instruction. You've probably seen this simple view of reading, and we can get pretty complex in looking at all the components that make up a successful reader, but two researchers, Goff and Tunmer, created this simplified view of reading in 1986. That multiplication sign in the middle is significant, and it indicates that both components of word recognition and language comprehension are necessary for students to be successful readers. So reading comprehension is 0 if either of those two components are missing. We can dig a little deeper into the simple view of reading by looking at the pieces that make up each component. So Scarborough developed this reading rope to show in more detail what makes up those two components of the simple view of reading. We've got word recognition and language comprehension. For this presentation, we're just going to focus on that top word recognition strand. There are three main skills students need to have strong word recognition: phonological awareness, also referred to as PA, decoding, and sight recognition. Now, all of us decode or we lift print off the page in the same way. We match the symbols on the page to the sounds they represent, and then we blend those sounds together to form words. Now, in order to do that, we need good PA skills. So, phonological awareness is our ability to work with the speech sounds of language. Skills like rhyming, knowing how many words are in a sentence, blending sounds together, and also breaking words up into syllables or individual sounds. No letters are involved at that level and in those skills. The second component, decoding, that's the skill that involves letters. So students have to understand that sounds are represented by letters, but that not all sounds have a one-to-one relationship with their spelling. That's also known as the alphabetic principle. And the last skill in word recognition is sight recognition. Now, not to be confused with high frequency word recognition, which are sometimes called sight words. Sight recognition is the ability to see a word and instantly process it. So if I could just geek out for 1 minute with some terminology, the term orthographic mapping is the SLP term we use when we talk about the process of storing a word permanently in memory for instant retrieval. So that skill is key for effortless, accurate, and fluent reading. Research has shown us that orthographic mapping is enabled by phonological awareness, that first skill in word recognition, and grapheme phoneme knowledge, which is the decoding piece, or that second skill in word recognition. So it's important to note that a grapheme is that written symbol we use to represent a sound, which is the phoneme. So the grapheme could be a single letter, or it could be a sequence of letters. For example, when a child says the sound t, that's the phoneme. But when they write the letter T, that's the grapheme. Or when a child says the sound ch, it's a phoneme. But they need to know if the grapheme is the letters CH or the letters TCH. So as you can see with that little review, there's a lot that goes into reading. And what's really cool is that scientists have done decades of brain imaging and other types of evidence-based research with thousands of children and adults to learn about how the brain develops the ability to learn the written code. We know that there are three brain regions that develop as children gain word reading skills, and you can see that highlighted in this graphic. Now, I could talk neuroscience for hours, hence my geek moment a few seconds ago. We don't have time for that in this review, but I did want to show you this graphic because it's a nice overview of what happens in the brain between those three areas. It's thought that beginner readers use the dorsal pathway, highlighted in red here, for the decoding skills as they're learning to read. In early reading, most words have to be decoded, so the letters in the word have to be linked to the sounds they represent. Now, as words become familiar and stored in long-term memory, they can be read more quickly, and that happens through that ventral pathway there, highlighted in green. Now, at that stage, reading becomes much more automatic. Also, at that stage, it's really difficult to look at a familiar word and not read it because the process is so automatic. And that's where we achieve sight reading. So, as you can see, it takes time and practice for kids to develop the neural pathways in the brain to become fluent and automatic readers. So, do all students who have trouble learning to read have dyslexia? Not at all. Any student can have trouble learning to read, and all students will learn the code at different rates. Some students will need a lot more instruction than others to learn to read, and that is completely normal. So it's going to be helpful for us to look at the most current definition of dyslexia. So we're just going to read through this together. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurobiological in origin. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in that phonological component of language that's often unexpected in relationship to their cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension. Reduced reading experiences can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. Now, I'm highlighting the word neurobiological here, and basically that just means it's a difference in the brain. There are functional and structural differences that have been found in those brain scans in the parts of the brain used for reading in people with dyslexia when we compare them to normal readers. And you can see that here in this slide. So imaging research has found that the brains of people with dyslexia show different or less efficient patterns of processing, and that can include under or overactivation of certain areas of the brain during tasks that involve sounds and speech and letter sounds and words. And you can see here only one area of the brain is lighting up, as opposed to the three in the efficient reader. Now, one important note here that we'll talk about in a little more detail in a few minutes is that with effective instruction, brain imaging has found that dyslexic students can activate all three areas of the brain, just like a typical reader. So in thinking about our definition of dyslexia, we can apply what we know to that previous simple view of reading that I showed you. If we put the word recognition on the horizontal axis and think of students on a continuum for those skills from poor to good, and we do the same for language comprehension on the vertical axis from poor to good, we can start to see what might be getting in the way of our students learning to read. Students who have good word reading and language comprehension skills are typically developing, but if they have poor word recognition and good language skills, they could have a dyslexic profile. Students with poor skills in both areas may have a language impairment that could include dyslexia or not, and if they have good word recognition but poor comprehension, they'd have a language comprehension deficit. Thinking about our students this way can help us tease out all the factors that are contributing to their reading proficiency and help us get better at assessing their skills, planning instruction, and intervention if they need it. Some other important facts to know about dyslexia are that it does run in families, and as I already mentioned, research shows that with appropriate instruction that uses foundational word recognition strategies, these difficulties can be remediated, and brain scans show increased normalization of those three brain areas when students are given the instruction in the foundational word recognition skills. Okay, so as a teacher, how do you know what's typical and what's not? Well, I'm so glad you asked. So, research shows that if after 6 months of direct instruction for our students learning to read in those basic word reading skills, if that student continues to have difficulty, we should be concerned. Now, students will show difficulty with spelling, learning their letter names, learning phonics, read slowly, or read below grade level. And if children are older, they may have a history of those difficulties. Also, for some of our older students, you might notice some of these things. A child is below the 40th percentile on STAR 360 and has shown a pattern of that. They are reading well below grade level or just below grade level. They're having difficulty with reading fluency. You notice in their spelling that their patterns don't match the sounds in the words. They have a hard time organizing their spoken language and might look like they're having a hard time finding their words. And their spoken language isn't developing like you would expect because they have good models at home and good language models around them. They might have problems organizing their written language. You'll see these students often guess what the word is based on the first letter, and they won't use decoding strategies to read through the word. They'll have sometimes difficulty memorizing number facts. Telling time can be an issue as well. And sometimes they have a hard time really expressing themselves clearly or fully understanding others in conversation. Now, one last really important note, not all students with these difficulties have dyslexia, but these are things that we have found kids with dyslexia often show. So one last note about reversals here. Do all students who have reversals in their letters or numbers have dyslexia? No, this is a really common misperception. So, reversing letters or numbers or mirror writing, which is like writing a word backwards, that's really common for kids up until second grade. Most kids who reverse letters before age 7 end up not having dyslexia. It's a sign that their orthographic representations, back to that orthographic mapping that we talked about, that has not been firmly established. It doesn't necessarily mean the child has a reading disability. Now, if you have an older child who uses reversals, they may not have gotten proper instruction in letter formation. They may have poor memory for how to form letters, or they could be struggling with visual processing. Again, it's not necessarily a sign of dyslexia. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope you found it informative and interesting. I'd love to get your feedback, so I hope you'll take a couple of minutes to fill out the survey that's linked in that first bullet. Grade 3 through 5 teachers, there's a tip sheet that reviews those key red flags on our slide presentation for the older students. And I also have some additional resources linked for you here if you'd like some more reading on the topic. Thanks again for taking the time to watch this presentation.